Yesterday I had the audacity to go outside without sunscreen on a 15 degrees Celsius overcast day, but then the clouds parted and the death ray hit my exposed flesh. That's why I look like a pomegranate now. Anyway, as amusing as it may be to venture onto the irradiated battlefield that is debating which is the best sword ever, what about the opposite? What's the worst sword? Well, it depends. And it's a stupid, vague question anyway. Thanks for watching. For real though, it's a complex question, obviously, with many possible answers, so let's explore a few. The classic answer is the Spadroon, or specifically the 1796 model, which has had some complaints leveled against it, including such trivial criticism as expressed by General Cavalier Mercer, who said nothing could be more useless or ridiculous than the old infantry regulation. It was good for neither cut nor thrust, and it was a perfect encumbrance. Tell us how you really feel. It's typically criticized for its foldable guard that may fail when you try to block an enemy strike. It's sometimes said to be too light, or it doesn't cut well, it doesn't thrust well either, the ergonomics are off, etc., etc. This has been discussed in great detail, and in fact this is not a sword that I'm familiar with. I've never handled one. I'm going to refer you to Matt Easton, for example, and other channels that have discussed this, linked in the description below. In short, the 1796 had some flaws that were improved in later model Spadroons, and it's important to keep in mind that not all Spadroons were made the same. So some were pretty good swords, others maybe not so much. In that time frame there were complaints about other swords as well, like for example the French sabre briquet or briquet saber, and others as well. Sometimes the soldiers complained about them not cutting well enough, other times they complained about them being too clunky, dubbing them the old wrist breaker, things like that. Either way, here's something important to keep in mind. As history progresses, more and more people get the opportunity to express themselves, and more of that is preserved to us. At first, it's just an elite class of clergy or scholars, and more the middle class gets access to writing and the means to do it. Eventually, even commoners get to express themselves, common soldiers. More complaints are preserved, and complaints by the grunts who have the boots on the ground. If you ask current day soldiers what's the worst rifle or handgun, you'll get different answers. And if you run with the first one you get, that might be a little bit inaccurate, or at least only one piece of the puzzle, shall we say. So on the one hand you have the tendency that as time goes on there are more and more complaints, but at the same time improvements have been made. If you were to tell me that a 1796 Spadroon is objectively worse in every way than a Bronze Age sword, I would have to say you might be taking the wrong medication. Don't get me wrong, bronze is a beautiful material, and this leaf blade is quite a nice shape, effective too for a sword of this size, but there's a lot left to be desired here. I mean, this grip here is very simple. There's no guard. It's got this big pommel that locks your hand into a particular position. And well, it's bronze. As pretty as it is, it can't compete with steel. And even when we're looking at bronze, early bronze blades would have been worse than later ones because they kept improving things. They kept altering the alloy. And in fact, a late Bronze Age sword might have been better than an early iron sword because they had to go through the same process of figuring out how to best do this. Now, there were still some advantages even to early iron. For example, you only need one ore, whereas here you need two different resources that oftentimes had to come from different geographical areas. The simplest answer to which was the worst sword in history would be the first one. I've made a video about the oldest known swords, which were made of copper, and the way they were shaped makes me think they weren't even intended to be used. The handles were weirdly flat and wide and not ergonomic whatsoever, but either way, the first usable sword that was intended for use probably didn't look a whole lot different. Another interesting example to point to is Danish flint swords. Scandinavia was lagging behind a little bit. While the rest of Europe, and especially the Middle East, had already entered the Bronze Age and was cranking out bronze blades, they were still in the Neolithic, basically. And they imitated some of the bronze blades that circulated through trade and tried to make them of flint. This is a pretty bad sword, even compared to a bronze blade, but at the same time, this may very well have been just a prestige item, something to trade, or an art piece. Essentially, it's not like they didn't make art back then, obviously. And in fact, it takes a lot of skill to produce such precise pieces of flint. So, as a sword, it would be terrible, but it's still very impressive craftsmanship. As sword development progresses, we eventually reach a highly developed type, rapier, which has plenty going for it. Complex hilt, there's a lot of features that have been added slowly over time, and many do consider this to be one of the best swords. But back in history, some people consider this one of the worst. Lately I've been practicing more with a basket hilt broadsword, and I can see more and more that, yes, George Silver was onto something. The long, narrow blade of a rapier is at a disadvantage against this. You wouldn't think so. You would think, oh, this superior reach and blah, blah, blah. But when sparring with a rapier against a broadsword, I found that, yes, it was quite difficult to deliver a safe thrust in particular, because normally against another rapier, you rely on getting a bind and winning the bind and then thrusting while covered. Here, the broadsword can just deny you and can just take over the bind and just not allow you to be on point in a safe way. In my satirical video about the superiority of the small sword, where the snobbish gentleman I portrayed talked about how the small sword is the refined version of the rapier, more advanced. Even though it was a joke, in some ways you can argue that. For civilian self-defense and dueling, it's just so much easier to carry. And it doesn't have some of the disadvantages that such a long blade has, which is that leverage can be used against you and you might get stuck more easily. There are also situations in which the small sword is arguably the worst thing you could possibly have. I mean, if you're fighting an armored knight with a poleaxe, yes, you could say the small sword could be used to thrust into the gaps of the armor, but good luck getting there. And then, of course, rather than looking for the worst type of sword, you could point at particularly poorly made examples. There's some very crudely made Deus Ex, for example. Probably forged in a few hours by some village blacksmith, lacking even the most basic handle. There's no evidence that handle scales or some kind of organic grip was attached. Maybe it was wrapped in leather or cloth, but there's even a painting depicting one of these with just bare metal, not even a wrap. That's pretty rough if you ask me. So obviously it's the same problem as when trying to decide which is the best sword. Best for what, or worst for what? Which situation, what are we talking about, etc. But I feel like there is a pretty fair answer to what's the worst sword. I found something that, if you're a sword connoisseur, will sear your eyeballs and put your brain into a vice. I hope the person who made it will never see this video, but I just can't sugarcoat it. I've never seen a blade welded on like this. It's a sight to behold. So, it's a bit silly in some ways to count modern wall hangers because they aren't even intended for combat, but if you just want to answer the question, what's the worst sword ever made? Well, we've got plenty to choose from. And if you want to include fictional sword-like objects, the abomination from the Sword and the Sorcerer can't be beaten. So postmodern wall hangers would be my answer, or if you want to go a little further back to make it historical, the Victorians made wall hangers. If you don't want to count that, then the first sword ever made would be the worst, for obvious reasons. It might be an overly simplistic answer, but in my book, those are indeed way worse than even the 1796 Spadroon. Hope you found this interesting. Thanks for watching and take care, folks.